Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to Merryn Talks Money, the podcast in which people who know the markets explain the markets. I'm Merryn Somerset Webb. This week, I'm joined by author David McWilliams, coming on to talk about his latest book, Money, A Story of Humanity. David is an economist and fellow podcaster. He's worked both as a central banker and on the financial markets in various ways. So he brings a unique and I think very interesting perspective to the history of money, which turns out to be the history of everything. In the book, David walks readers through time from the day the first gold coin was minted to the modern incarnation of money, or maybe not as money, today's Bitcoin. He explores ideas on how society's fate is closely linked to the strength of its currency and how you can destroy a state by destroying its money. Welcome, David, to Merryn Talks Money.
Merryn, it is an absolute pleasure to see you again. How's life? All good?
All the better after reading your book.
Oh, thank you.
David, one of the first things I thought when I was reading your book was that I have read, and I'm sure you have as well, so many books written by someone with an obsession about something. They look at their obsession and suddenly they can explain the whole world with that obsession, be it the collapse of the Roman Empire, the extinction of the Aztecs, the French Revolution, Christianity, wealth of medieval Italy, whatever it is. And then they say, well, this was caused by my obsession, which could be salt, gut bacteria, the invention of stirrups, weather, hive mind, demographics, how many young men there are in a population, that sort of thing. But your book, I think, is actually correct. It is maybe money that is the thing that explains everything.
Well, wouldn't say it's an obsession, but when you end up doing economics in university and then you do a bit of an postgraduate, because frankly you don't know what to do. You've got a degree. So, oh my God, what do I do now? And then you find yourself working in a central bank as a monetary economist as a young fella. And then you realize, okay, so this is quite interesting. This is the place where we kind of magic up this thing called money. Okay, fine. And then I went to investment banking and saw the way credit was being pushed around the world and how basically the private banks were creating money out of fresh air. And I thought to myself, okay, this is interesting. And then in Ireland, we've had exactly like the UK, we've had our boom bust cycles, and I just thought to myself that I've spent 30 years kind of observing the relationship between humans, ourselves, and this strange thing called money. And that was the initial idea. And then the idea was like, well, why not look at money as this miraculous technology that has enabled humans to do extraordinary things, and see whether or not, if you go back to the beginning, that you can actually thread that particular argument convincingly to yourself first and then on the page. And yes, I think you're right. I think it wasn't a eureka moment, but it was one of those moments you just thought, actually, this is the thing. This is the social technology that has really acted as I say in the book, a sort of a Promethean force for humanity, for good and ill. And that as that argument becomes developed and becomes a little more nuanced or becomes a little more pronounced in certain stages, you begin to think, yeah, this is the technology that humans invented to cope with complexity. And where you see complex societies and you see complex relations, you begin to see the coincidence of money or a form of money emerging. And then with that form of money, you also see what I would describe as the co-evolution of many other things that I suppose we would regard as pillars of human civilization. So numbers, empiricism, writing, legal systems, organized religions, all these things, all come at around the same time.
I mean, the key idea behind the book is that money is a shortcut. It's the ultimate life hack, that money allows you to have prices inside which all the information you require to understand a lot of things is available immediately.
Exactly.
And so that shortcut allows innovation, allows social and economic flexibility, and gives us every big change in the nature of money or the understanding of money or the way that money is used can and often has led us to a new level of prosperity or a new level of innovation. That's the basic key, right?
That's the basic idea. And it doesn't seem like anything except common sense, really, when you think about it. But I do think that what has happened in our particular business, in the business of economics, and again, I speak as a former, central banker, which is the kind of holy grail of monetary economics. It should be, at least. Anyway, I kind of got the impression that economists don't tell the story well enough. Not because they're unwilling but maybe because they're unable. And that is a big charge. It was like, I mean, I teach monetary economics at Trinity. I teach economics to postgraduates. And over the years, I've thought, look, hold on, there's more to this, And I think in a way, economics has shied away from these much bigger notions of money as this miraculous, what I say, wondrous technology, a product of human imagination, etc. So then you've got into a little bit of evolution, a little bit of biology, a little bit of history, and try and see the creature that is money in its totality. Yeah, and I don't think our profession has done justice to what is an extraordinary human creation.
Yeah, we haven't done enough to talk about, as you said, the social aspect of it. All right, let's talk about some of these big turning points. Where do we begin?
The Sumerian civilization is where we see money emerging. Not particularly different, actually, conceptually to what we have now, which is kind of interesting. And I think what you see there is the coevolution of money and writing, for example. And I know it doesn't sound very heroic, but writing started as an adjunct tool for accountancy. Again, we would have thought that writing was some great sort of hero, some great poet, some great piece of literature. No, actually, in fact, it was just basic writing stuff down. Who owed who what, and when were they going to pay it back? And then, of course, you see, when you go on to the Lydians, probably the next big civilization, they really innovate with coins, and they introduce gold coins. And gold coins, I think coinage is very interesting because coinage is essentially a very democratic notion. That if, for example, think about it, you're in a very hierarchical structure in terms of the way in which societies are organized. But with this bizarre thing called a coin, a prince's fiver and a pauper's fiver are worth the same. So this is a very weird idea that suddenly you get almost a leveling out of social hierarchies with this bizarre technology. And of course, the other invention the Lydians came up with was they introduced smaller and smaller coins. You're allowing commerce to seep into the tentacles of society in a way in which previous civilizations didn't do. And of course, the Greeks then take that baton and do what the Greeks did all across the board. They make it better. And so the Greeks are the first really heavily financialized society that we come across. And also, I don't know about you, but years ago I thought, you're doing this stuff in history and school, and things, why were these Greek fellas? What made them sort of smash the sort of intellectual glass ceiling when it came to philosophy and art and democracy and republicanism and all these incredibly sophisticated notions? And it strikes me that it's inconceivable these things would have happened without a monetized society. And the reason is because money makes you count. It makes you think empirically. It makes you think precisely. And if you see the shift, even from the Homer to Xenophon, 200 years, like big philosophers, Homer's talking all about myths and Xenophon's talking about logic. So the Greeks made this kind of intellectual leap in a very, very quick period of time. It also happens to coincide with the mass circulation of the drachma, which ironically, or not ironically, I just think fascinatingly, was called the drachma then and was the drachma up until about 18 years ago, which means a handful in ancient Greek.
Yeah, look at that. Another thing the EU destroyed. The oldest currency in the world.
So think, why did, for example, Christianity emerge?
Oh, yes. No, I'm really interested in this one. This is one of the bits of the book that I found particularly compelling. This idea that Christianity was a result of this huge increase in inflows of bullion and silver into Rome in the first century.
Yeah, no, it struck me that, again, these things interest you in a sort of odd conceptual way between pints if you're having a chat in the back of a bar. Why did Christianity start where it did and when it did? And why did it catch on so quickly? Because it's a really radical idea. You're talking about a world which was very macho and gods who were super alpha males and alpha females, okay? This was a pre-woke world, let's just say, right? And suddenly this geezer comes along and says, no, you see all those powerful people, they don't inherit the earth. You do, the weak person. See that rich man? He's not virtuous. You are virtuous. And it struck me like this is such a radical idea that could it have been a sort of ideological counterweight to the emergence of a meritocracy, which were being forced by this technology money? And I think yes, because it is a very radically different philosophy. So it must have been incredibly attractive to people for whom the monetary economy wasn't going their way. Okay, for the losers, in effect, which is I always think why Christianity is quite interesting, because it's a religion for losers. It's quite an interesting take. It's the people who lose out.
Yes, it gives you some compensation for being the
It gives
loser.
you compensation. You need a countervailing narrative that says, well, look, it mightn't be working out here, but in the next life, I'm going to be sitting up beside St. Peter's.
Everything's going to be fine the next life.
Yeah, St. Peter, angels, it's all going to be good. And I thought that was an interesting observation to think, wow, could it have been a response to the commercialization of the ancient world? And is it any doubt, or is it any coincidence that Christianity was an entirely urban phenomenon, as too was commerce, as too was the marketplace? So these are the sort of things that I think are interesting, and once you begin to think about them, again, I don't make these big claims. I just think it sounds plausible.
Yeah, and Rome comes up a lot in the book and a lot in the history of money in general. And one thing that I hadn't read very much about before was the story of the Tiberius's credit crunch.
Yeah, it's a good one, isn't it?
That's a great story. Tell us a little bit about that, because of course it's going to resonate with people today, perhaps.
Well, I mean, again, like you and I have been writing about money for many years, and I think you're always fascinated at our endemic repetitive stupidity when it comes to booms and busts, and this time it's going to be different, and I'm going to make money, I'm going to get out first, la la la, right? And so you go back to Tiberius, so it's AD 33, and Tiberius is sitting in Capri. He's had a very good reign, reasonably peaceful. They've conquered Egypt, loads of flows of grain, loads of flows of bullion in from Egypt, all is going well. Surprise, surprise, interest rates fall, as they would do in the modern world. And surprise, surprise, you get a boom in assets. And the asset of choice is the property market. And in particular, second homes in the provinces that were recently conquered. So it's basically the Roman equivalent of Irish people buying property in Bulgaria in the boom, right? And or British people buying property in Spain, Tenerife, etc., right? And so what happens is, like in all good Roman stories, there's a coup, there's a pretender. The pretender galvanizes some support. The emperor waits on the sidelines for a while, then comes back, then kills the pretender, and then rounds up the pretender's followers. And lo and behold, he realizes that a huge amount of the senatorial class were prepared to jump ship. Why? Because Rome was an empire of money. And if you back the right horse, you may well have been personally enriched phenomenally if this new emperor came in. So what he does is basically says, I'm going to hit them in their pockets. And he, in effect, tightens monetary policy. What he says is, you're going to have to set aside X amount of your property in cash. And as a result of that, you get a credit crunch. As a result of that, we know what happened in the UK during the credit crunches, which is amazing, is that money kind of disappears because it's hoarded. And once it's hoarded, asset prices fall. And as asset prices fell, Tiberius did what I suspect Ben Bernanke should have done in 2008, maybe taken a slice of the action in return for the cash for trash scheme that he unveiled. But what I love about this, Merryn, is the fact that we're back to the same place. The Romans were dealing with credit crunches. We're dealing with credit crunches. The Romans were operating a monetary policy. We're operating a monetary policy. The Romans' asset of choice was foreign property. Our asset of choice is foreign property. So, and fascinatingly, the contagion that we see in international markets now was evident then. That also interests me because money is social. It's psychological. And panic and herd behavior. So as I say in the book, I think economists, when they see a price, they see a number. When most of the rest of the world sees a price, we get a feeling. And that feeling is what drives the animal spirits. And the animal spirits are what drives all the good stuff and the bad stuff.
And of course, when we talk about Rome, there is the general idea that the Roman Empire fell in the end because of not treating its money with proper respect.
Yes.
The continual debasement of the currency in the end is what's destroyed the empire.
Yeah, and so much so that towards the end, they could only print the emperor's head on one side of the coin. Yeah. They were so thin, and it was there was no proper hard metals in it. Or very, very, very little, the ratio. And again, and that story, we go into Dante in the book, we go into Renaissance, that story of debasement, counter-debasement, all that sort of stuff is ever present. And I think it's a fair point. I looked at a survey. And I think it came up with it's in the book, I think 214 reasons have been given over the years by historians for the fall of the Roman Empire. But ironically, money isn't one of them. And that is amazing, isn't it?
I would have thought that was top of the list.
I would have thought it would be central to understanding, did the Roman Empire fall because they debased money, or did they debase money because the empire was falling? Which was happening at the same time. But I would have thought at least it should be on the list. At least we should explore that because it's very, very evident the data on the debasement of the currencies is really ubiquitous. Those sort of things, again, I suppose the book tries to take these stories and give them a little bit of historical flavoring and resonance. If you debase your currency, we started the book talking about Hitler trying to debase sterling. If you debase your currency, what you actually do is you mess with people's heads. It's much more than just prices going up and down, right? And as you said at the start, the price is like an encyclopedia of knowledge. The greatest shortcut we have. It tells you an enormous amount of things. If you mess with that, you're messing with the very foundations of the way in which we see the world.
Well, you write about that when you talk about destroying money. You say when money dies, trust and stability and society break down. So we take this organizational technology that we use to make sense of really an incredibly complicated world. But, you can go in and out of shops and you can buy things because all the information you need is contained in the price. So kick that away. And everything becomes completely unmoored.
People freak out.
Yeah. And there's a lot in the book about various stories around it. You can use the way that money can destabilize societies in wartime endlessly. So another story I didn't know, 1793, William Playfair counterfeiting French money towards the end of the French Revolution to try and destabilize things further. But let's go back. Let's go back to Italy, which pops up again and again and again and again, and the Renaissance. Because one of the really great connections that you draw in the book is that it's not just about economic innovation and economic change that comes as a result of changes in the money system or advances in the money system. It's artistic innovation and change that comes as well. And the Renaissance is a classic example of that.
Absolutely, and again, there's a character in the book called Leonardo of Pisa, who's better known for mathematical students as Fibonacci. But I make the claim, or at least, again, it's suggestions. These are polite nudges rather than sort of boisterous claims that, without Leonardo of Pisa, there's no Leonardo da Vinci. And the idea is that da Vinci comes at the tail end of an economic and financial revolution that was anchored in Florence by a currency, the florin, the hardest currency of its time, in a way like the dollar would have been over the years. And there is a direct connection not only to Fibonacci, but ironically, Leonardo da Vinci ended up going to a reckoning school. And the reckoning schools were schools that were involved in empirical analysis and accountancy, which were in effect the MBAs of the day. And Da Vinci went there. So I thought, this is fascinating, that Da Vinci's education was actually an economic education, an accounting education based on the numbers of sequencing of Fibonacci, who learned his mathematics from the Arabs in Sicily, who borrowed their mathematics from the Persians, who borrowed it from the Indians. And those things really fascinate me. And the fact that, the Westerners, and I mean the Christian West, referred to zero and algebra as Saracen magic. So they believed that somebody was whispering, some magic form was whispering inside the heads of Arabic merchants who were simply doing mental arithmetic because they were much more sophisticated financially, mathematically, numerically than we were. And of course, once you break that, again, glass ceiling, you open up a huge, huge amount of change, and also I think social change, like the emergence of merchants as a countervailing power to kings and warriors in and around this period, armed not with lances or spears, but with money. It has a profound catalytic impact on things like the Enlightenment, which come later. But for me, there's a reasonably direct link between them all. And of course, the Reformation. Pop that in there just
for good measure.
Yeah, an Irish person and a Scot having a chat. We could not throw in the Reformation. So again, these are, as I said, gentle nudges rather than boisterous claims.
Well, I mean, I found all that bit particularly interesting because I've always been very taken by research that suggested that wealth in that sort of early period in Italy was a result of a more equal spread of wealth, a concentration of wealth that was less intense than in much of the rest of the world. And that was one of the things that led to the ability for people to invest and the ability of people to get rich, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, back to your point, that couldn't have happened without the changes in the money system backing it up.
Yeah.
So it all comes back to your string that runs the whole way through.
And the fascinating thing is if you look at Dante's Inferno, right, the Commedia, which is obviously the text of that shift from the dark ages into the light of the Renaissance, so from darkness into light. What really intrigued me, I was in Florence about 3 years ago, and I was doing a tourist guide, right? I just paid up some guide, and this guy came along, and he was very interesting, and he asked me what you did, and I said, well, I'm interested in economics. And he said, oh, that's it, I'm interested in money and the florin. And he said, that's interesting. He said, did you know that Dante reserved possibly the worst punishments for a counterfeiter? And I said, no. He said, so strong was the Florentine political and economic establishment behind the hard currency that in actual fact, a real counterfeiter, an English chap called Adam, tried to actually debase the florin and was punished severely in real life for his efforts. And Dante placed him in the 8th circle of hell, just one above Lucifer himself. So that's how they really thought about money. They thought, back to your point, if you destabilize the currency, the money, you destabilize the system. And the system is bringing us to a place, this Florentine Enlightenment. So these things fascinating. It's funny the things you pick up of when you're doing a €5 tour of Florence in an hour, and then of course you go down your rabbit hole and you find out about all these things.
Cheap tour, David. €5, very cheap.
It was probably 20. It was probably €20.
Probably. Let's move forward a little bit. QE and the Great Financial Crisis. Is that a turning point in money? Did that change the nature of money in the West?
I think it has changed a lot of things. I think it's changed the understanding of what can be done by central bankers. I don't think even in their more dreamlike state, they could have imagined that a cash for trash scheme of such a monumental phase could be introduced without totally debasing the system. But what it has done, of course, as you write about it, on a weekly basis, it has profoundly changed asset prices, and asset prices have profoundly changed the sociology of money, who gets what. And it has led to the amplification of inequalities, simply because people who depend on assets for their income, as opposed to the vast majority of people who depend on wages for their income, those people are being rewarded. And a lot of social problems. You mentioned Brexit. We could argue that Brexit might not have happened had it not been for QE. We can argue that Trump might have not have happened had it not been for QE. That very wedge that's driven between, let's say, the working man or the left behind or whatever you want to describe them, and the elite was certainly amplified by easy money. So I think that, I think was it some Chinese premier who said, what do you think of the French Revolution? He said it's a bit too early. I think with respect to your question about QE, I think it's possibly too early to really understand what it has done to the global financial system and also to global inequalities and the subsequent and evident political backlash.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it does, and it should change the way central banks behave. I mean, I remember at the very beginning of QE, someone cleverer than me pointing out to me that QE is not really a monetary policy, it's a fiscal policy, because it changes the distribution of wealth, and that changes everything. And therefore, central banks shouldn't be allowed to do it at all, because it uses the powers that a democratic government should be able to use. And yet we've now been at it for, a decade and a half.
Yeah, and there's no sign of it being consigned to the bottom shelf.
And when you look at that, you might wonder whether we are treating money with the respect that it deserves. Going back to our earlier conversations about many different times in history where money has not been treated with respect. Are we doing it again?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good point. I think that both of us are moving in a similar direction. That you're not so much you're debasing, but you are certainly taking away some of the steadiness. And steadiness is a strange word. It's kind of a boring word. It's a very Whiggish word. It's sort of like the sort of thing that Edmund Burke would come up with, right? But it's a very important thing to be steady and to be transparent and to give people, one of the interesting things about money, and I think you've probably written about it too, money is one of these weird tools that allows us to live in the future.
Yes.
When people are taking out a mortgage, they're kind of envisaging who they might be in 30 years' time and what they might, there's nothing else we use on a daily basis that allows us to do this.
Yeah.
And as you say, if you go down the road of every time there is an asset crash, which you and I know happen with extraordinary regularity, the way in which you will actually plug that particular gap is by a bribe, in effect, to asset holders. And you debase this brilliant technology. And as you say, you debase at your peril,
Yeah, and you take a bit of trust away in it. So that's an excellent point for us to move over to Bitcoin, which I have to say you kind of started the book with, because you talked about the Ashanga bone, which is effectively a type of ledger money, right? To the extent we can see it like that kind of ledger money, a bit like the thing you didn't write about in the book that I simply cannot believe you didn't put in, which is the rye stones of Yap, which is one of my my favorite money stories.
The Yap story was just told too many times.
I know, but it's such a good story, right?
It is a good story. It's a great story.
And once you've read it, you can't stop going around the world looking for rye stones. I've just been in Tokyo. There's one in one of the parks in Tokyo, and ages looking for it.
I love it. No, so yeah, but you're right. I mean, so the blockchain thing, when I hear the tech bros telling me the blockchain is new, right?
Yeah.
That the ledger is a new idea, and I'm looking at this, and I went to the Belgian last summer. When I was just putting the finishing touches of the book, I decided to go over to Belgium and go to the Natural History Museum in Brussels. And like all museums in sort of second-rate cities, and I don't mean that in the sense of Brussels, but they don't really look after it. So basically, it's a couple of weirdos and, like me, looking at things, and hundreds of really bored school children, right?
Yeah. Are you going to tell me they've got a rye? Yeah.
They're on the bloody school tour going, oh my God, what are we doing here? Anyway, point is, this little baboon's femur, and it's very shrunken now because it's so old, little notches, suggestive of basic accounting, of a basic ledger. Don't tell me that the blockchain is anything more than a digital version of something that Africans, our ancestors, were messing around with 20,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And it brings me to Bitcoin. I suppose what fascinates me about money is its ubiquity. This very counterintuitive idea that although you can debase it, in order for the technology to work, it can't be scarce either. It has to be bountiful and plentiful because it is a network technology. And the more of us who use it, the more of us come into the network and the more powerful money is. So it's got this slightly paradoxical element at its core, which is that scarcity, whether it be the gold standard or Bitcoin, is actually the characteristic that makes money less attractive. And ubiquity, like in a language, I compare it to a language. So we're speaking the English language. We were talking about going to Barra before we came on in Scotland. Many people in Barra continue to speak Gaelic. Many people in Irish speak Irish. But the usefulness of the English language is because the rest of the world uses it. And we use it to communicate on Bloomberg, and we can talk to many people. Money is the same.
Yeah.
A scarce money, like a Bitcoin, is effectively the Esperanto of money, right?
I love that. I saw that phrase in the book. It's one of my favorite phrases. I'm going to use it all the time.
But you know what I mean? It's like if you meet anybody who speaks Esperanto, it's incredibly important to them. They can't stop talking about it.
But they can't talk it to anybody else because none of the rest of us speak it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the same carry on with Bitcoin.
One more thing before we end is the other thing that a lot of cryptocurrency people like to think is new is this idea of a conflict between public money and private money.
It's as old as the hills.
And of course, that's not new at all because, think siege coins, corporate scrip. I mean, all the many, many types of private money we've had in the past. And of course, money is far too powerful for a government to give that power over money away. So in the end, these private monies, they do disappear.
Exactly. I mean, look, one huge fact, and I call it a fact that comes out from researching thousands of years of the history of money, is that the state owns money. whether we like it or not. And they're not about to give that power away to a couple of tech bros, right? Okay. No matter how much they lobby the SEC. What I've said, Bitcoin is just like, it reminds me of a very, very well-financed residence committee. You know, the residence committee are always lobbying the government. You can't build that here. You can't build that. I right to my view. Bitcoin is like, it's like a lobby group, right? And the more people are in it, the more they're trying to lobby the SEC to have this and that. But my point is, it's not money in any sense that I understand it. Like, by all means, go and buy Bitcoin. I've bought Bitcoin for the crack, because I like to see this thing jumping up and down. But it ain't money. Very, very simple.
So what, if that's not money, what is the next big leap forward in money? What do you see?
I think what we're going to see, I think what the book also says is that leap forwards we don't really do. We do gradual, iterative, almost evolutionary process. And I come back to language. You know, the English language is most useful primarily because it's most promiscuous. It has adopted and taken on board bits of French and bits of German and all that sort of stuff, right? And it's comfortable with its promiscuity, right? And that's what gives us its richness. And exactly the same way in money, that there's no great leap forward in language and there's no great leap forward in money. What there are little, small, iterative processes, always, Merryn, and this is the key, solving some problem, right? Our problem with crypto is there ain't a problem big enough to be solved. The global financial system, warts and all, like the English language, it's not perfect, but it is. And that's the key. It is. It exists. So I end the book, as I started the book, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I started the book in Congo 20,000 years ago. And the emergence of a fascinating little monetary technology called M-Pesa in Africa, which has really interested me. I was doing some work in Kenya, and I was looking down the road, and there were hundreds of people outside. What was in effect a mobile phone hawking station? It wasn't even a shop. It was a lad selling it. And I said to the person who was with me, I said, you know, what's this? And he said, oh, that's M-Pesa. I said, what's that? He said, it's our currency. I said, how do you mean it's your currency? I've got this shilling in my pocket. This is your currency. He goes, well, no, don't we use that, right? We use that for buying beer and things. But actually, the currency we use to trade is mobile phone credit. I thought, Jesus. And they said, yeah. And who would have thought 10 years ago that mobile phones would become banks and mobile phone credit would become money?
Yeah.
And it solved a problem of a non-financially sophisticated country. They leaped from non-banking to banking, but their bank is their mobile phone. And that I find fascinating.
It is amazing. I've used it myself in Kenya. It's a fairly
amazing,
extraordinary innovation. It doesn't solve a problem for me. It doesn't solve a problem for you, but it solves a problem for the majority of Kenyans, which is what makes it so interesting. Yeah.
Exactly.
David, last question. I can guess your answer, but I have to answer it. I have to ask you anyway. 10 years, one asset, gold or Bitcoin?
Gold.
Any other asset you would definitely hold over a 10-year period?
I think, unfortunately, things like very boring things like everybody holds, property, bricks and mortar. Basically, it moves along. Our societies have made it so cheap, ironically, to put money into property with all sorts of tax scams, you might call them, that is, again, a construct of society. And I would say, I mean, the interesting thing about Bitcoin, it's fun, but it's not real.
That's a great place to end it. Hate mail to the usual address, everybody. David, thank you so much. Thanks for listening to this week's Merryn Talks Money. If you like our show, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And you can keep sending questions and comments to merrynmoney@bloomberg.net. You can also follow me and John on Twitter or X. I'm at MerrynSW, and John is John_Stepek. This episode was hosted by me, Merryn Somerset Webb. It was produced by Summer Sardi and Isabella Ward. Production support and sound design by Moses Andem. And special thanks, of course, to David McWilliams for that fascinating chat.